Hey everybody, Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports, and today we're going to be doing an install on these Fox 3.0 coilovers and rear shocks for the 2010 to 2014 F-150 Raptor. These are a really awesome suspension setup, definitely a huge upgrade over what you get from factory, and probably something you want to consider if you either have worn out suspension or you're looking to just get that extra bit of off-road performance in your truck. Now, normally I try to do as many installs as I can here at our shop, but some stuff is a little out of my league and takes a little extra time that I don't have. So we're actually going to throw these in our 2013 Raptor right now, take it down to our buddy Joe, and we'll get started on that install. To gain access to the front suspension, we first need to remove our wheels. While we're there, we can remove the dust cover and axle nut from the hub to unbolt the axle. Next, remove the brake and vacuum line brackets that are attached to the knuckle and the strut tower to provide additional slack. Also remove the vacuum line from the back of the knuckle behind the axle. From there, move down to the lower control arm and remove the sway bar from the end link. Then loosen up the upper control arm nut until it's at the end of the threads, but do not remove it completely. Now remove the nut from the tie rod end and use a hammer to break the tie rod free from the knuckle. Take a hammer and hit the knuckle near the upper control arm to allow it to pop out slightly. From there, we're going to relieve the tension on the upper control arm by loosening it at the strut tower connections. This is optional, but it does make moving the UCA a lot easier. With that done, let's move to the top of the strut and remove the 3 nuts that attach the strut to the shock tower. We'll also remove the upper control arm nut from the knuckle and rotate it out of the way. Now remove the bottom bolt holding your factory strut and the lower control arm, and then lift the entire unit out of the vehicle. With the factory strut out of the way, we can slide our new Fox 3.0 coilover into position. Lift the unit up and loosely attach the top of the coilover to the shock tower with the provided hardware. Do not tighten these nuts down just yet. You may need an extra set of hands to help position everything as you reattach the hardware. Use the factory lower bolt to attach the coilover to the lower control arm. Do not tighten this bolt down completely, we'll come back to it later. From there, we can insert the upper control arm back into the knuckle and loosely thread the nut back on. Now position the axle back into the knuckle and carefully spline the ZV into the IWE and hub. Then tighten the axle nut down, but be careful not to over tighten it. Once complete, simply tap the dust cover back into place. After that, we can move to the top of the coilover and tighten down the 3 nuts securing it to the shock tower. Then tighten the upper control arm nut securing it to the knuckle. Next, retighten the upper control arm connections at the shock tower and reattach the sway bar to the end link. At this point, we can also reattach the tie rod end and tighten it down. Now move back to the bolt holding the bottom of the coilover to the lower control arm and tighten that down as well. With all the components positioned and tight, we can now go back through and reattach our vacuum lines and brake lines. Some of the plastic connectors may be broken, but can be easily replaced with zip ties. Lastly, we need to mount the remote reservoirs for our Fox coilovers. Take the provided hardware and drop it through the holes in the frame near the front bash plate. Once the hardware is through, go ahead and attach the reservoir bracket to the truck and tighten it into place. Now take the reservoir and mount it to the bracket using 2 hose clamps and lock it down securely to complete the installation of the front coilovers. Moving around to the back of the truck, you'll need to start by removing both the upper and lower shock mount bolts. With both bolts out, we positioned a bottle jack between the leaf pack and the frame to push the rear axle downward so we don't have to compress the new Fox 3.0 shock as much for installation. Next, we positioned our new Fox shock in the truck and attached the lower mount bolt. We then released the bottle jack slightly to help align the top of our shock with the top mount on the truck. Once we had it lined up, we inserted the top mount bolt, tightened it down, and that completes the install.
So first off, talking about the suspension, I do want to chat a little bit about the on-road performance. Now, obviously off-road is really what this is for, and we will get into that, but I will say for those of you guys who are running your Raptors and have factory suspension that's in decent shape. This will probably feel a little bit stiffer than what you're used to, but for the most part, it's almost identical to the factory ride. Now, the suspension we had on our truck was pretty blown out and it was in rough shape, so some of the bigger bumps and things, even on the road, hitting speed bumps or going into dips, you could feel it hit a little bit harder and it didn't really soak up the big hits like it should. So swapping to this did help that out, but it doesn't feel so stiff that it breaks our back or anything like that. It's just kind of the right amount of firmness that the truck should have had anyways. So I would say for the most part, this is gonna feel probably pretty similar to factory on the road, and I don't think a lot of you guys will have issues with how it rides using it every day. So let's talk about the off-road performance of these Fox shocks. Now, we're basically north of Phoenix right now, kind of outside Lake Pleasant, out in the desert. We've also had this truck up in Williams, running around in the snow and the mud and everything like that, so we're starting to get a more well-rounded idea of how it actually performed. The first distinction, though, that I do want to make is that this is a kit with the DSC adjusters, and you can actually either option it with those adjusters or without. And the way we got it, we left it just at the predetermined settings that Fox had and ran it like that for quite a while, which felt really good. And then today I had a chance to basically crawl under, kind of dial it. I basically shifted the high and the low compression all the way to max and then all the way to the minimal setting just to see if there was a dramatic change in between the two, and ran the same stretch of road to dial that. And I would say there was a difference. It felt like when you adjust the compression, it would get either softer or a bit more bumpy, but overall it wasn't a night and day difference. Now, some of that may be because they're designed to be adjusted within mediums and not maxes. And so possibly if you knew what you were doing and you're the type of person who's got kind of an engineering mind and you want to dial it in and figure out the optimal settings for the terrain you're hitting, you might notice a more dramatic change. But for somebody like me, and I think a lot of the guys that work around here, we were happy with the settings that it came with, and we don't really need a lot of big changes. The shocks perform so well regardless that it's almost unnecessary in my mind. Really, the big thing, regardless of whether or not you do have adjusters or how you option those shocks out, is that the Fox suspension is excellent. I've been super impressed with the way this performs off-road, and a little bit of that can be credited to the fact that the Raptor is naturally a off-road ready platform. But I was curious after driving it completely stock if really, the wear in the factory shocks was enough to make that big of a difference, or if I was gonna see a significant change with the new Foxes, or, it was just kind of hard to say because you're buying a vehicle that's already off-road capable. But it became pretty quickly apparent, especially at high speeds, that these 3.0s are a huge step up. The way they soak up the bumps and everything is really nice. You're not cruising on just a pillow the whole time. I don't want to give the idea that this is gonna be like a limousine ride through the desert. You still feel bumps and you still know you're hitting things, but it really does a good job of ironing out the small stuff and then also dealing with the really heavy hitters. And that might be probably the most impressive part, is the big heavy hits where we're jumping this vehicle at 70 to 80 miles an hour, or we're coming into washes or ruts and things. It just soaks it up. It's amazing how much force you have to get this to even get near the bump stops. And realistically, all the driving we've been doing today, I haven't even touched it. Even after jumping the vehicle, it didn't bottom out, it didn't act funny. It's very controlled, very poised. It really gives you a lot of confidence when you drive the truck. Still, it does have its flaws, and probably the biggest one is that this is going to be a very expensive suspension kit, and you guys already have a lot of money invested into a Raptor if you've purchased one, and probably money invested into wheels and tires as well. So this is going to add even more cost on top of that. Now, depending what you do, typically the DSC adjuster front coilovers like we have here, just for the front set, are going to be around $3,000. Then if you option them without the adjusters, you might save $200 or $300, but you're still gonna be up a couple grand, and that's only for the fronts. The rears are a couple grand on their own as well, and you can buy them as a full kit to squeeze a couple extra bucks out of it, but no matter what, you're making a big purchase. Really though, as big of a purchase as it is good to know that you're still getting something for the money. And I would say for those of you guys who have a Raptor with some heavier mileage on it, or have put a lot of off-road wear and tear on there and want a better suspension, or trying to get out of a burnt out factory suspension kit, this is going to be an excellent option and will probably be worth the upgrade just because it does improve the ride so significantly, and it allows you to basically do off-road faster and for longer. And really, if you have a vehicle like this, that's probably what you're looking for. So talking in terms of basically jumping the vehicle or hitting heavier whoops and things like that, a lot of the suspension performance is going to come from the front being able to soak up the weight of that motor moving up and down, and also just the general force of the vehicle pushing it forward. But the rear shocks do plenty of work as well, and I've been super pleased with how those perform coming down. The vehicle usually tends to land evenly, but the rear soaks up a lot of the impact there. It doesn't feel like it gets jittery or out of control. And really that's a big thing even on washboard roads or just high speed driving, is maintaining that balance where you still have traction, but you can have a little fun and kick the back end out. And really this system does allow you to do that. It's not gonna shake up so bad that you can't get speed or that you can't keep planted or keep the vehicle where you want it, but it will still allow you to soak up those bumps and work it around. Like the front suspension on this truck, the rear does have adjustment as well. With that though, it's not quite as simple. Whereas the front has a high and low knob that you can turn on basically each reservoir of each coilover, the rear has a couple different lines coming off of it, and it looks like it needs to be adjusted with a wrench to actually get the settings dialed in. So that's gonna be a lot more involved process to change, and honestly, we just left them the way that Fox sent them. I'd imagine you're gonna get similar results to what we had from the front, and I know some of you guys are gonna be upset that we didn't try every aspect of that, but the reality is that we don't have the knowledge or all the time to change everything and figure out how to dial those. So if you are somebody that has these on your truck already or knows how that works, feel free to leave a comment and let us know. That would be excellent information to have. But I will say, with the settings that they are in currently, they ride just fine. And I would imagine that you could probably turn a wrench a couple times and maybe dial it in a little better to washboard or a little better to jumping, depending on what you're using your truck for. And something like this is able to hold up to these kinds of roads for many, many, many miles, and you don't have a lot of heavy driver fatigue, and you don't have to worry about breaking things or smashing things under the vehicle. It's built to do this. And really that's kind of what the Raptor's for anyway, isn't necessarily hitting the heavy articulation stuff where you'd want a, locked up Jeep on 40s with no fenders. It's made to hit stuff where you're blasting through the desert at high speed and you're just covering ground and having a good time. And really that's what it does well. So that's what we tried to cover, but we have gotten it in a few areas where it's a little bit more hairy or where four-wheel drive might be a bit more necessary. So overall, my final thoughts on the suspension would be that it is an excellent upgrade over the factory stuff, especially if you have some heavy mileage on there. I think it's very confidence inspiring. It's amazing to be able to drive the vehicle as hard as we have been and jump it the way we have been without having basically negative repercussions from that. I'm sure over time you're probably gonna beat it up or wear it out doing that, but you can get away with quite a bit before the suspension starts to give on you. In a lot of cases, you guys probably, depending on what you do, if you're using it as a daily driver, may not be hitting situations that are that difficult or may not be comfortable jumping your vehicle, and that's just fine. You're still probably going to appreciate the off-road performance or the comfort nonetheless. And for those of you that do drive hard, you'll get to utilize the full potential of a system like this. So that's a wrap, guys. As usual, feel free to leave a comment below. Let us know what you guys think of the video or what you want to see in the future with this Raptor build. We'd be happy to hear from you. And also, while you're down there, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you check the links in the description, those will shoot you over to our website so you can check out the actual listings on the suspension that we have here on this truck. And I will see you guys next time.